Hey, Luna. Hey, everybody. Good morning. Hi, Kylie. Trying to go ahead and share it out. Make sure that I'm double sharing to people. Hope everybody is having a wonderful morning. I am hoping. Hi, Jedi. Hi, Gilly. Hope everybody is having a great morning as I get set up here. I figured over the last couple days that we just probably take it back to where we started, and that's why we were doing the other one yesterday. And then I thought we'd do a little bit more on Homo erectus because it has been a while since we've actually had a conversation on Homo erectus. Hello, Dakota. Hello, everybody. It's so good to see everybody. Hello, Spiral. People change their names on here, and I lose people because they've changed their names. So it makes it difficult sometimes. And if I miss people or I don't know who you are, I apologize. I get fixed on names. Hello, Callie. Yeah, I know you're still Luna because Luna's still there. Some of them you keep like the name in there, so I make sure I know those ones, right? Oh, that's awesome. I'm so glad you got to rewatch the new documentary. It's really, really just like I need to get into it, and like what I need to do is put it on my computer so that I can screenshot some of the pictures and then get really deep into some of the pictures and see what's going on with some of those pictures. Because some of those pictures absolutely make me think that we're dealing with writing. Like, oh my God, I'm just so thrilled by the idea and just so thrilled by seeing another early human that is even earlier than us that is doing these really amazing things, right? That's awesome, Spiral. That makes sense. It is on Netflix, Luna, and it is Cave of Bones, Unknown Cave of Bones. Unknown is like a series, and then Cave of Bones is the actual documentary. And it is actually going through the Homo naledi find, and Lee Berger is heading the documentary, and he goes through the cave, and they have all the pictures of the cave, and they describe the cave better than I ever could. And he shows different. They have the art on the walls. The art on the walls looks fantastic, and there's a point in there that the art on the walls, and this is where I have to like get it on my computer and screenshot it and get in really close, because there's this point in there where the art on the walls actually looks like runes. Like it's lines like this with markings in between the lines, and I'm like, like I plot, like sitting on my couch giggling and jumping around. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, I think it's runes. So it's really absolutely stunning and beautiful. And just the different things you'll see in there where you can see like red soil with like this black patch in it. When you see that, that's fire. If you can see the soil of something and then see like a black patch in the soil of something, that's actually evidence of fire, like a fire pit, because it's all burnt out ash and charcoal in that patch. And so there's a couple of images where you'll see in it where it's like deep, dark red earth with this patch of fire in the middle of it. And I'm like, so. Right. The Naledi versus Neanderthal versus Sapien. So when they're looking at this, there's the hash mark, and we've talked about, I think, recently, because he had put out recently that they had seen that hash mark, and I think it was all over the news about them seeing the hash mark in Naledi. And so when he was talking about it, he was talking about the fact that with the hash mark, we also see the hash mark in some of our earliest Sapien cave art and some of our earliest Neanderthal cave art. And this could mean any number of things, right? It could be that because Naledi is in the same space in South Africa that at least part of Homo sapien comes to being in, that maybe Homo sapien sees these in the early part of their being, and they carry this on to Neanderthal. And when they start doing cave art, it actually works along with it. Absolutely. Now I'll touch on that. But it could also mean that this is kind of the easiest thing for somebody to carve and mark and actually say. right? Because if you think about it, if you're trying to scrape something into a rock surface, the easiest thing to scratch into a rock surface is a straight line. But you also can look and see that there are all like cracks in rocks that would look like that. So to try and make that straight line look like you made your mark, you might do that in a couple of different ways to try and make sure that it looks like a human mark, right? So it could be several different things that absolutely spiral. Do you mean in here? I don't know if it'll let you share a pic in here. But it could just be that it's the earliest thing. Wow, Grimace, that's reportable, dude. Just saying. That's nasty and reportable. And yeah, we don't yeah, I know you're new to my space, obviously, and so I will let you know this. But uh this space we don't deal with racism very well. Um Race has been debunked, race does not exist. And I don't deal with racism, which does still exist, right? Um, that is something that narcissistic God kings, the people in control, are trying to instill in you so that you hate others instead of hating the fact that somebody up there is trying to fucking kill you. So you can keep your racism elsewhere. We don't do phobias based on gender and desire in here either. This is a space of kindness and safety. That's what I'm trying to do, and I expect the same in return from anybody in my space. And if you're going to come in here with racism or phobias based on gender and desire, or just hate in general, you're going to get reported and you're going to get blocked. So you have so much fun elsewhere, but not in here. Let me go ahead and answer that question that I got from Nayab. Is Nayab okay? I'm not sure with the name how to pronounce. I wonder what you think of the alien hearings and distraction discussion. I believe aliens exist. I don't believe in the whole ancient aliens made us thing, but I believe that it's pretty egotistical to think that we're the only thing out there. And I believe that there are other creatures out there. There are other planets. There are other solar systems. There are other beings out there. I believe that kind of like Star Trek has like the prime directive of you can't contact somebody who hasn't reached a certain place. We haven't reached a certain place. Like we're a little bit of a shitty species to each other sometimes because we've kind of set aside the things that are positive for our species and we've kind of been trying to kill each other for a minute. And so that's actually one of the things in the prime directive for Star Trek, actually, is that, if they're still like trying to kill each other, we can't go down. So I kind of think that there are aliens out there and that there's something like that in place that says that unless you're actually like, doing something positive, unless you've reached this positive place, there's no contact. And so when I look at things like the emitting of aliens out there or the emitting of the UFOs, I just kind of go, yeah, that makes sense. I knew it, right? Dad, if you're talking about the fact that my beautiful Homo erectus sibling here is dark of skin, that's because Homo erectus, like Homo sapiens, starts out dark of skin to the best of our knowledge. In fact, we don't see light skin alleles until 900,000 years ago, which is about 1.3 million years after the start of Homo erectus. And so Homo erectus is actually where we first see our light skin alleles. As we were just discussing, race doesn't exist, racism exists. But being dark of skin doesn't have anything to do with the qualities that you possess, just like being light of skin doesn't have anything to do with the qualities that you possess. And race is a theory and a concept that was based on white people trying to commit atrocity and justify their atrocities. We talk about how race has been debunked in here frequently, and we'll probably touch on it a bit today. Once we get to the whole genome project, it's able to debunk the idea that race exists because genetics are pretty universal. This does not imply that dark skin is primitive. So this person actually looks like a human. And I know what you're talking about because as an archaeologist, part of the thing that I do within my field is try and change some of the shit that's been there that has caused problems like this. And when you look at the earlier renditions of Neanderthal, you look at renditions that are rendered light or dark of skin and rendered like hunched and rendered looking and acting primitive. And it was associated that those were backward or more primitive traits and therefore associated with people from Africa. And from Australia, right? And so I do understand what you're stating when you're stating that, you think that the Homo erectus being dark of skin up behind me is about race. It's not. It's about the fact that to all of our knowledge with Homo erectus, we do see that they start dark of skin and that they're at least a million years into their existence before they start developing the alleles for light skin that they then pass down to Neanderthal. And Neanderthal is actually who passes down the alleles for light skin to us. Light skin is not a advance in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, light skin can be extremely detrimental to the physical health, where you don't really see that with heavier melanin content. The change in melanin content actually comes after the change in eye color and probably the change in hair texture, though we're not exactly sure where we get that straight hair. But humanity is absolutely meant to adapt, and that's what the melanin content in your skin does, is it gives you that ability to adapt. So we're not discussing race, we're discussing Homo erectus, but we're not implying on any level that Homo erectus is actually primitive. And in fact, if you talk or you hear and you listen, you'll hear me talk about the fact that Homo erectus is where science starts. Homo erectus is who gives us fire. Homo erectus has clothing. Homo erectus is the first to cross water. Homo erectus is the first to build. Like the Homo erectus is the first to create and to adapt adaptations. And Homo erectus is why we are the people that we are today. And not only that, but mentally and thought process wise, Homo erectus are in no way, shape, or form primitive. Just so you know. We don't think that Neanderthals were the first to do surgery only because we don't know yet, right? Like we haven't found anything that states that Neanderthals did surgery. We do know that they did medicine. And the person missing a forearm, it doesn't look like it's an amputated forearm. It's just missing the forearm. Like obviously they had a damaged forearm and he lost the forearm, right? But, and animals aren't primitive, Dad. Now you're being kind of, okay, so first of all, somebody mentioned the 6,000-year-old thing. We see the start of light skin becoming more predominant in Northwestern Europeans starting about 5 to 6,000 years ago. And that means that you're looking at maybe roughly 50% of the population. About 3,000 years ago, you're looking at maybe roughly 80% or 60% of the population. At roughly 2,000 years ago, you're looking at 80% of the population. At 1,000 years ago, at least 10% of the population in the northwest part of Europe, Eurasia, is actually still dark of skin. Dark skin is actually what we lose last. We lose the dark of eye before we lose the dark of skin because it's more important to have eyes adapted to low light environment than it is to have skin adapted to low light environment. Take your cod out of here. We're not talking about your God in here. He's a narcissist, and I don't deal with abusive people in my chat, and your God's abusive. So please take your God out of my chat. We don't deal with your religion. Your religion is abusive and it causes harm. You can't hear me? Is that more than Luna? Or Lunar? Okay. Okay. Just wanted to make sure. Lunar, are you okay? Can you hear me now, honey? Okay. When we look at the first Europeans were very dark, right? In fact, I have a beautiful image of Cheddarman, who actually I'm related to, right? Like many people who come from that region, I'm also related to people from every other region. But a beautiful picture of Cheddarman that shows him dark of skin and light of eyes. And we can actually trace when those changes kind of come about. So that's awesome, Luna. So I am going to go over again just kind of some of the different things that we have within this chat. So TikTok gives everybody with 1,000 followers a live chat room, right? You can come and you can go live. I choose to use that for education. I am an archaeologist and an anthropologist. I was in medicine before. I'm a historian, and I am trying to teach. And I don't believe education should be kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall, and I don't think education should be kept behind extremely big words that make it hard for even those of us with extensive images, or images is in the chat, sorry, with extensive degrees or extensive knowledge to understand. Like I have stuff I have to literally look up every other word to parse out, even though I know a lot of language. So I come into TikTok and I teach what I know best. And it ranges depending on the day, and it is definitely about who we were, not who we are. And it is an attempt to show people the kind, nurturing, loving, creative beings that we are. And kind of a bit. So, well, and I'm not teaching history because history is flawed. And history is written words. So anything prehistory is, it depends on where you're at, whether or not it's prehistory, right? And written word actually is further back than most people want to state, right? So, I'm not teaching history. What I'm in here talking about is archaeology and anthropology, animism, and anti-racism. Okay. So today what we're talking about is Homo erectus, which is the species that we kind of descend from, right? Is our grandfather is a great way to put it. And so I'm in here talking about Homo erectus today and what Homo erectus gives us and what Homo erectus brings us. And the person on the wall here, this is Java Man. Java Man looks kind of female in this image, but this is Java Man. And Java, we do not know the biological sex, of which there are 3 biological sexes, if you did not know, male, female, and intersex. And we do not know the biological sex of this person because we haven't gotten their DNA, but this is Java Man, and this is a Kinnis and Kinnis image. And you can find how to get to Kinnis and Kinnis images on my site up here, the widdaord.com site. For the person who asked about the YouTube is in.widda.ord ... So the same as my username in TikTok with the ... at the end of it for the YouTube, where I'm also streaming at this time and where you can find all of my prior lives that have been recorded on there. Java Man is Homo erectus. Oh, fuck, off the top of my head, I can't remember the date of Java Man. So let me look and see what the date of Java Man is so that I can give you an accurate date. Java Man, no, that is not telling me exactly him. That is telling me the dating of Java with Homo erectus. Let me look. Did you not give me the exact dating of this specific fossil? I would like this specific fossil. Well, he's older than 500,000. Okay, so they have a wide range of estimate on when they believe Java Man lived. Apparently, it's between 700,000 and 1.4 million years that they believe Java Man was. And it seems that, I can't tell if they're trying to estimate the entire time on the island is that. Yes. Okay, so that is. That is what they are considering. They don't have an exact date on it. And this is probably because it's so far back, it's hard to get an exact date sometimes when it is so far back. So the dating on him is between 700,000 and 1.4 million years old. I would say he's probably roughly around a million years old. And so he was found in Java, on the island of Java. It doesn't actually state where. Solo River in East Java. Okay, there we go. Have to make sure I don't remember these facts off the top of my head. Usually some of them I have to look up. So especially when it comes to dating. So when we're looking at the Homo erectus that we have, especially at this far back, again, they've recently discovered that the allele for light skin doesn't come about until 900,000 years ago. So it's more likely that he had dark skin than light skin. And this is because when Homo erectus speciates in Africa, like pretty much all of the hominin species except for some of Homo erectus's descendants. And because Homo erectus speciates in Africa, Homo erectus speciates with the needed bodily adaptations for the area that they are in. We all have melanin. Every single one of us have melanin. The density of your melanin, the amount of your melanin protects you from the sun. It protects UV rays, so it protects you from the radiation, and it also protects from the vitamin D within the sun. You can overdose on vitamin D just like you can overdose on anything else, and you can kind of overdose on the sun. And so it kind of protects you with that. And then the dark eyes are because of the fact that I have gray eyes. And if I try and go out in the sun with these light gray eyes, it hurts. It's painful. I like went without my hat yesterday and I was doing this all day long because my eyes are so sensitive to the sun. The lighter your eyes are, the more sun sensitive they are. So developing with dark eyes provides that sun protection. There's been some studies done by a beautiful Black anthropologist and archaeologist on hair, and they had a focus on hair already. And so they did some studies and they discovered that the tightly coiled, what is often referred to as 4C hair on the rating scale, which is a racist rating scale. So I try not to use it as much, but to make you understand what I'm talking about, the tightly coiled hair actually comes from the fact that it gives you this kind of shade, and then it gives you this lattice work that air can flow through. Right. And that lattice work, the air can flow through along with that shade to the top of the head prevents the brain from boiling. So having our beautiful brains, we need that protection for our beautiful brains. And this is from Homo erectus down. So this is what we actually are seeing. I am not a person of color. That is very obvious. I am an indigenous human being, though. So I am not a white person. I'm just not a person of color. I am light or white assumed. But I do agree that I try everywhere to uplift my darker siblings' voices so that people can hear from them, especially when we're talking about anti-race and stuff like that. And I totally got that out of that. Beautiful. I totally got that out of that. I really, for me, it can be problematic if people are more willing to listen to me because of this light armor than they are that somebody who's darker. So especially if I'm talking about race or I'm talking about things like that. Though at the same point of time, I know that sometimes people just don't respect and to hear. So it's a problematic space sometimes. But I absolutely do wish that we had more people of color who were being heard on this subject and on all of these subjects. But when we look at Homo erectus, and we will be doing more guest speakers again, but when we look at Homo erectus, what we're seeing is the kind of, and that's true, beautiful. I totally get that. And because it's automatically assumed half the time that I am being racist, right? It's automatic. You see people coming in that automatically they're saying that I'm doing something racist or that I'm trying to promote race or that I'm trying to promote that dark means primitive or something like that. And so I absolutely see that side as well, that it can be easier for people of color to hear from somebody who is a person of color. I'm indigenous, but I don't go into BIPOC spaces. Like if it's a space that's BIPOC only, I don't go. And it's because of the fact that, well, I'm indigenous. I also know that you don't know that from across the room. And so seeing me across the room can make somebody feel unsafe. Right. And so I won't go into BIPOC spaces. So I absolutely see that. And I absolutely think that that's a very true statement and a very needed statement. And another one of the reasons that to me, I'm very big about uplifting darker voices, my siblings who are darker voices, so that people can hear it from them as well, for both sides of that. Because I would much rather not make white people comfortable, which is a little bit of a shitty thought process, I know. I'd much rather not make white people comfortable by light people, by being light people around them, right? And I do know that there are some things that just really don't come across as being what I'm intending them to be because my white assumption, right? So What do you think I'm doing? It's me. Just a question. I mean, what do you think I'm doing? Because I can tell you what I think I'm doing. I think that I am teaching people that we are a beautiful species that knows nurture, that requires, not even knows, that requires nurturing, community, and creativity to bloom and blossom. And that instead of hating each other and causing division between each other, we should see that those who are trying to cause division are those that are trying to harm us, and look towards them instead as the problem and the issue in the world, because we are not each other's issue. Your issue is the people who are overtaxing you, under caring for you, and trying to kill you and exploit you for everything you are, until they leave you a husk on the street, and then they turn everybody against you because now you're houseless. And there must be something wrong with you, because you're no longer exploitable, because you've been exploited for everything you are already. That's what I'm trying to do. If you think that I'm trying to do something else, I'd love to hear it. That's it, right? I've been accused of a lot of things, and I know there's a lot of assumptions, but those are assumptions based on how you would do it, not how I would do it. And well, I really try not to be unique. Unfortunately, my upbringing and the life that I have led means that I don't think like anybody else. And you top that off with being neurodivergent. I really don't think like anybody else. My intentions, are not always pure. I admit 100 fucking percent. But my intentions when it comes to other humanity is to make you see the beautiful that you are. And that's a selfish intention. It's selfish because I know that for me to feel safe to leave my house, I need to change what's going on outside my house. For me to feel safe in the world, for me to not be harmed by everybody around me, which is what happens to the vast majority of us, that I need to change the way everybody around me thinks, so that everybody around me can pull themselves out of where they're at, so that they're not out to harm everybody around them. Okay, that they're not inadvertently doing it, or they're not participating in it. Because selfishly, I don't leave my fucking house because I'm too afraid to most of the time. I'm getting better, right? But this is selfish. Absolutely, I will admit that. And wanting to change things is selfish. I will admit that. Uh, at the same point, I can also state that it really comes from this belief that we are all beautiful and wonderful. And it really comes from this need for everybody to see us in this light. Because if we can all see ourselves in this light, then the pain that so many of us are feeling goes away, right? If we can all see that we are this beautiful, nurturing, creative um, being, then we can return to that, and we can ensure that we move forward as a species. I'd like my great grandchildren to have a place to live, right? We can move forward as a species, and we can ensure that we can do it in a greater deal of health than we're in now, because so many of us are not okay. So many of us are not mentally okay, because so many of us have compassion and empathy, and watching the world around us makes us sink into this horror of what's going on around us. So many of us who are okay because they lack compassion and empathy. And so many of us are not okay because we're being beat down physically and mentally on a daily basis, right? So I am here because I was taught from the very first breath that I took that it was my job to heal people. That's why I was in medicine first. And to me, healing people starts with understanding who we are and getting away from the indoctrination that you've lived under. That's it, right? We are all indoctrinated into a thought process. Healing people is changing that indoctrination. We are all indoctrinated to believe that we are all evil, that we are all monsters. There is something wrong with every single one of us, and that our entire life is to fight against that monster, to fight against that evil. And for a vast majority of us, we have spent half of our lives feeling that way, that we are a monster, right? And that we have to fight against our base urges to be better. I don't believe that. I believe that we are nurturing and communal, and we've been fighting against that urge because we've been indoctrinated. So Homo erectus dies out at roughly 170,000 years ago. This is after about 2 million years of existence. So it's not necessarily that something happened to them. It's just that their time and the cycle is gone, right? Um, Same thing happens with Neanderthal. Neanderthal is 600,000 years as a species, right? And you don't see that Neanderthal being 600,000 years as a species is ever really a very large species. You see that Neanderthal in its entirety of its time being, to our current knowledge, that this is probably going to change shortly because we've pushed back its timeline as well, was only about 500,000 Neanderthal beings as a whole. We actually have more Neanderthal DNA on our planet today than we did during the time that they were alive as a species whole. Um, and we do know that Neanderthal went through two almost extinction events that really shrunk down their species, which wasn't ever any large species to start with, right? And that we enveloped Neanderthal within us. So nothing really happens to Neanderthal either. It just is that the timeline, right? So the idea that anything is meant to live forever is a little bit weird, right? We know that the cycle life shows that things are born and things are dying, right? That you must have birth to start and you must die to make room for the more, right? And to replenish the earth, because that's what death does as well. Like it returns the body to the earth, it returns that nutrients to the earth, right? And so when we look at that cycle of life, the fact that things like Homo erectus dying out and Homo neanderthalis dying out, these aren't necessarily failures for their species and we survived. We've actually been on the planet less than half the time that Neanderthal was on the planet. It is the fact that species have a species cycle, just like we have a life cycle and a birth, just all these different cycles. Our species, like the other species before us of hominin, of upright ape, of Homo, are tenders. We are those who tend. We are those who care for the environment. We are those who tend the biome, nurture the biome, right? Every species on this planet has a place in this chain of, I guess chain doesn't sound right. Circle of life. Every species on the planet has a space in the biome. Every species contributes to the biome, whether it's the trees contributing the air, whether it's chipmunks and squirrels gathering the different nuts. And when they leave them in little houses, the ones that get lost or left behind end up sprouting into trees because they've been kind of cracked open and nurtured in a warm environment, right? So no matter what it is, every species on this planet has a job here, a part here, right? And ours is to nurture and tend. Ours is to just harvest a little bit and enough so that it can bloom. Ours is to ensure that the animals around us have a space that's healthy. That's our job here. And before us, it was Neanderthals, and before it was Homo erectus. And Homo erectus lives, like I said, about 2 million years. And you see that Homo erectus living about 2 million years. Thank you for the chipmunk. That's awesome. Homo erectus living about 2 million years, they went through a lot of different knowledge and a lot of different understandings. Ours is a big responsibility. Though we have to remember not to take that, oh, we have this big responsibility to the idea of, oh, that means we're great. Because one of the problems that we have currently is we think that we're a pinnacle when we think that we're superior, when we're really just another species in the biome. Ours is a big responsibility that we have kind of forgotten, right? Like, when I talk about rights, this is a huge one to me. When we talk about rights, we forget responsibility. Rights come with a responsibility. My right to life comes with the responsibility of upholding your right to life. My right to breathe air comes from or comes with the responsibility of ensuring that you have the right to breathe air, right? And so we don't think often about the responsibilities that come with our rights, just like we kind of think sometimes, well, we're this great big pinnacle and that doesn't come with this responsibilities that it comes. So it's a very true statement, and I'm not stating that you in any way, shape, or form would take it to that thought process. I just want to make sure that everybody understands that we do have a great responsibility. That doesn't mean that we're great, right? That doesn't mean that we're epic. It just means that we do have a great weight, one that we have failed to uphold for the last couple hundred years, absolutely, and had started failing to uphold a while ago, right? It is, I've heard, a very Buddhist concept, Ali, and from what I know of Buddhism, yes, it's also an animistic concept. And you see this animistic concept among pretty much all indigenous spaces. You do see some indigenous spaces don't think in an animistic thought process. but pretty much all indigenous communities that you see pre-Christianity, pre-Christian colonization, actually have that animistic concept. The thought process that we are just another animal in the biome and that we have a responsibility to the biome. So when we're looking at Homo erectus, what we're seeing is not the first Homo. So Homo means human. It also means same, but that's in Greek. In Latin, which is where we got it from for this thought process, it means human. So genus is the step right above species in the taxonomy. And the genus that we belong to is the genus Homo. So the other species that belong to this genus are Homo habilis, Homo erectus. There's a whole friggin' list, and I'm not going to hit all of them just because I'll forget half of them. But Ergaster, Antecessor, Rudolfensis, Neanderthal, Denisovan. These are all other Homo species. When I say Neanderthal, what I'm talking about is the species name, and the genus is Homo. So they are not the first genus Homo, they are the second genus Homo. The first genus Homo that we think of is Homo habilis. Now, Homo habilis, handyman, was for the longest time considered to be our first tool maker, but last year we realized that they're not. Our first tools actually come from Paranthropus boisei, or the nutcracker man, which is a really amazing concept. So we actually see that Homo doesn't develop tools, boisei does, or not boisei, Paranthropus does. When we see that Paranthropus boisei develops tools, we also see that Paranthropus boisei is living towards a later part of its time as a species with Homo erectus and Homo habilis, and they're all kind of living together in groups. It's actually now thought, as we're understanding our speciation better, that the speciation of Homo erectus might have also come out of the speciation of several different species living in the same bands or groups. Often we look at the word tribe as meaning a thought process or meaning a way of being for a community, but the word tribe means a community based on genetic lineage. And the word band means a community not based on genetic lineage. So many bands are living in the space that Homo erectus speciates out of. And these are bands of different species, actually. So you're seeing Paranthropus boisei, Homo habilis, and a couple other species all living together at the same time. And they now believe that this is where we get Homo erectus starting from. We see that Homo erectus starts at about 2 million years ago. When we see Homo erectus start, we see that Homo erectus is the first hominin for like 7 million years to make it outside of Africa. So we currently believe that the last common ancestor between us and chimps, or one of the missing links, is about 7.2 million years ago in Greece. Yet our earliest fully upright that we have, that we know of, our first, because I think chimp actually falls under hominin, but I can't remember. But our first fully upright, our first antecessor of us, is 7 million years ago in a lake bed in Chad now. And so from that point on, you don't see any of our species ancestors like Australopithecine or Paranthropus or anything like that outside of Africa until you get to Homo erectus. Then Homo erectus, at about 100,000 years into its time as a species, makes it outside of Africa. This was that tooth that they found in Georgia last year or the year before, where they're like, oh my God, we found a 1.8, 1.9 million year old tooth in Georgia. It was Homo erectus's first leaving outside of Africa. So Pangea breaks up at its final point of breakup at 275 million years ago. So Pangea has been gone for like 268 million years, 269 million years by the time the first upright being comes, the first upright walker, the first of us, that lake bed in Chad. Hi, Nikki, Nicole. So when we see Pangea, Pangea predates us by millions and like 200 and something million years, right? So Pangea doesn't come into play with us at all. Oh, okay, perfect. I just wanted to double check, Marshmallow. I was like, I had to double. I saw the first comment. I was like, okay. So, when we're looking at Homo erectus being the first outside of Africa, we see Homo erectus just has a lot of firsts. We see with Homo erectus that we see our first usage of fire with Homo erectus. We see with Homo erectus that we see our first language, vocal language. It should be understood that everything on the planet has language and communicates. The trees communicate. The trees make little matriarchal clans, and they all live in big forest nations, which just, but the trees communicate with each other, the grass communicates, animals communicate, everything communicates. Vocal communication is something that we first see within Homo erectus. And we know this because of the shape of their lungs and chest, the shape of their rib cage, and the way that their rib cage will compress to expel air for vocal communication. And because of the imprint of their brain on their skull that we have left that shows the pathways of language in that imprinting. So we know that Homo erectus has language and that they're the first to really have language as a vocal pattern. We also see within Homo erectus that really, to me, this is our first scientist. This is our earliest understanding of science. Science is I see something or observe it in nature. I have a hypothesis or think of what that observation might mean. I predict what that hypothesis might mean, and then I test my prediction. And if my test proves true, then I have a theory. If my test proves false, I go all the way back to my hypothesis, right? So when we go to the first understanding of science that we see within Homo erectus, we see that, well, Paranthropus boisei makes the Oldowan tool complex. The Oldowan tool complex remains really the only tool complex that we have for quite some time. And the Oldowan tool complex is a pretty rough complex. You get kind of a blade that you can use for scraping or cutting, and you get hammerstones and cobblestones. These are the things that we also see here in the Cerruti Mastodon find in San Diego. That's the 130,000-year-old find here in San Diego. But you get hammerstones and cobblestones, and you get kind of a blade for cutting and scraping, but you don't get like a lot of the extensive tools that we end up seeing later. You see that this starts with Paranthropus boisei with our newest information, but it doesn't change until we see Homo erectus. This is roughly 1 million years later that it changes with Homo erectus. And it's roughly early on into our understanding of Homo erectus, to my remembrance, that we start to see Homo erectus take this into the Acheulean assemblage. And the Acheulean assemblage includes that Acheulean hand axe that a lot of us have heard about. The Acheulean hand axe is small. It's about 6 inches usually. And what it is it's basically a teardrop shape with the blade being the bottom part of the teardrop, and you can hold it at the top. And this is something that personally, to me, having worked a lot of hide, looks like it could really be used as a scraper. It could absolutely be used as something to chop and absolutely be used as something to cut. And so we see that this is this first understanding of this shift. We are the only species currently on the planet that adapts our adaptations. Crows make tools. Other primates make tools. Corvids, not just crows, corvids make tools. Other primates make tools. Other primates, or other animals will build houses. We see that the beaver knows how to build a dam, but they've been building the same kind of dam for their entirety. They don't adapt their adaptation, right? And so we have this ability to adapt our adaptations. And it is that adaptation adapting, right? It is the adapting of those adaptations that really takes us to the point that we have phones and everything else. And so we see that Homo erectus is the first to take an adaptation, a tool, and adapt that tool into something new, into something that works better, into something that is an improvement in their minds, right? And in our minds as well. I just say in their minds because sometimes our improvements aren't necessarily improvements, right? But it's just something that is an improvement. And we see that when Homo erectus starts this understanding that they can take things that are already there and change them into something better, and then change that into something better, that more developments happen. It might be, it's not half truth, it's half understanding of beavers, but that might be true. So when we are looking at the way that Homo erectus is moving and the way that Homo erectus is interacting, we see that it is this ability to adapt their adaptations and to adapt their surrounding that really facilitates a lot of this. Homo erectus is the first, to our understanding, to use fire, and not utilize fire, to keep fire, to hold fire, to make fire, to be able to use it outside of this happen chance that they find it, right? So if I am coming along and I don't know how to make fire and I see that lightning has struck a tree, which caused a fire in a tree, and the cat that was on the tree roasted, I might eat that cat and understand that cooked meat is good, right? If I see a fire on a tree, I might grab part of that and take it back with me to camp and keep it for a while and be able to keep it for a while. But I'm not going to be able to make it better. Like, I'm not going to be able to remake it again. I'm not going to be able to understand how to keep that fire going until I actually use some science, right? And so when we're looking at the way that science works, again, we're seeing that observation and we're seeing a hypothesis and then a prediction and then a testing. When we're looking at, hi, sugars, when we're looking at the way, the possibilities of how Homo erectus gets the ability to contain, to hold, to recreate fire, there's a few different thought processes that you can go down. We don't know for certain how we get to this point. Some ideas and some knowledge states that it could be either, if I find a piece of fire that's burning, like a log that's already burning, like the tree scenario I was talking about, I can take a part of that back and I might learn how to feed uh, that coal just enough to keep that coal alive, right? Now, I might learn how to feed that fire enough to keep that fire going. And I know that I have to feed something to that fire to keep that fire going. Now I have to figure out if, how to transport that fire to my next place. Like, so now I might take a coal and figure out how to keep that coal so that I can restoke that coal and create a new fire from it. So this might mean, taking that coal and putting it on a rock because I'm saving it for later and then it dies out. Well, shit, that didn't work. So take a new coal and I go, well, it needed food. So I put it on a rock and I put some moss around it. But putting it on the rock and putting the moss around it, it just ate up all that moss and died out. So now I might think, well, I need to kind of keep it a little bit in a container so it doesn't get as much air. So I might take that moss and that coal and I put it in a container so it doesn't get as much air. It still kind of burns through it because the container is open and I'm like, well, that didn't work. So what can I do now? So what I might end up doing is, well, when it hits the wet things, it stops burning. So maybe what I do is I take and I put my coal in the center and then I put a little bit of moss around it and then I put some damp moss around that and then I put it inside the container and let just enough airflow in. And now I've developed a way to carry this coal with me from place to place so that I can restoke my fire when I come to a new place. It might be that their ability to control or capture fire comes from flint napping, right? Because you can actually make sparks while you're flint napping. And if you're making sparks when you're flint napping and they land on some tinder, say you're sitting among a bunch of dry leaves outside and you're flint napping with your friends, and a spark falls on the dry leaves. And when the spark falls, the spark falls on the dry leaves, and because the spark falls on the dry leaves, it catches the dry leaves. And when it catches the dry leaves, we see that the spark, oh God, that's not going to work that way. It's going to have to come off this way. We see that I look weird taking my shirt off is what we see. We see that when the spark falls on the dry leaves, that it catches fire. And so now I might think, well, shit, if I'm, I can make a spark from mashing two rocks together. But how do I get that spark, brought into a fire? Well, first of all, I've got to figure out which two rocks. OnlyFans, TikTok style. Now I have to figure out which two rocks I've hit together that create that spark. And I also have to figure out how to build that spark from just a little spark to, that totally makes sense, fans. And little spark into a big old fire, right? Now I have to figure out what tinder works best for that. And so these are all different ways that we can come across how to figure out, or how Homo erectus figured it out. Again, we don't have a definitive yet, right? We may never have a definitive. So we just have a bunch of different ideas, but we do know that they utilized fire. It is this utilization of fire that actually not only gives them some new tools, but it also gives them some real big advantages. When we're like looking at the different ways that you are hunting and gathering food, getting food, one thing that a lot of people don't quite understand is that we actually have so many tools that are lost to the fossil record. So, like a wooden spear is going to be lost in the fossil record past a certain point. Any baskets, any leaf tools, any woven tools, any fabric tools, these are all going to be things that are going to be lost in the fossil record after a certain point of time. We did come up with a new way to test things last year, and where you can actually take a core sample and DNA test a core sample, which might eventually give us, oh, there's a heavy concentration of plant material in this area. So we know that they made a basket out of this type of plant in this area. But we haven't gotten to that point yet. It's coming, hopefully, right? So we do know that they're using other tools and that the stone tools are just the only tools that are surviving in the fossil record and surviving for us to come through. Thank you so much for all the corn. Um, if you don't know, corn is Abiyalian traditional creation. It is something that both Abiyala, which is South America, and Turtle Island, which is North America, indigenous peoples husband from something that looked like a wheat stalk into what we know of as corn today over few thousand years, right? Several thousand years, because people were here in Turtle Island and in Nabiyala before Sapien was in Northwest Eurasia. And so several thousands of years, they husband that from a wheat stalk until the corn that we have today. Corn is something that is very traditional Abiyalian and Turtle Islander. And so I love my corn. Unfortunately, a lot of it is GMO today, so you kind of got to watch it. But it's a really great thing. That's why it's for corn today. When we're looking at that ability to create fire, and we're looking at the fact that we understand that there are other tools in the fossil record, we just don't know what other tools are in the fossil record because we're not seeing them, because it doesn't last as long as stone does. One thing that we've often understood is that there are spears that are being used early on that don't have stone points. There was a recent discovery of a double-ended spear in Germany that is associated with Heidelbergensis, I think. But because these things don't last so long in the fossil record, they've been so much harder to find. So when we look at creating a spear, I can sharpen a piece of wood, and I can sharpen a piece of wood to a really fine point with a knife, but I'm sharpening a piece of wood to a really fine point with a knife, and then I take it and I hit it against something as easy as human flesh to puncture, and it's going to blossom. It's going to mushroom out at the end, because by sharpening it with a cut, you've actually weakened the integrity of the wood. If instead you were to take that stick and or that tree, that sapling, most likely a sapling is your best bet. You get a nice green sapling that's nice and straight, you can cut it off, but you take that sapling and you have a fire and you can heat that sapling until it's nice and warm, and then you're hot, and then you roll it away, and then you heat it again, and then you roll it away. And this is tempering this wood. It is making this wood stronger, this heating and cooling process. Stop laughing. Wood is talking about trees. It's this heating and cooling process that we still use today when we temper steel, right? So this creates a harder form of wood. And in this creation of this harder form of wood, it hardens the integrity so that when you're hitting something with it, it itself is not going to kind of just break on you. And then you can take that tip and you can put it in the fire. And as you heat it up and get a good coal on it, you can use that coal to kind of just grind it against the stone, right? Sand it against the stones around your fire. And by sanding it against the stones around your fire, you're going to create a nice sharp point that has high integrity, because you've tempered the wood and you've tempered the point, and you haven't broken the construct of the wood, the core of the wood. I just said it 5 minutes ago. You haven't broken the integrity of the wood by cutting it, right? So this gives you the ability to create a spear that's not got a stone point at a time when we don't have the ability to make stone points. So Homo erectus taking fire to make different tools, or being able to create fire, gives them the ability to create different tools in a much stronger way. The other thing that fire really gives us, and this is why you are today, this is literally why you are today, the ability to cook your food equals a pre-digestion of your food, which means that you're able to get greater calories from a smaller amount. And the greater calories that you get are easier to digest by your body. So, especially when we're looking at fats, and especially when you're looking at fish oils and things like this, or fish fats, what you're seeing is that the extra calories, especially in neonates, especially in pregnant women, and especially in children, up until the time that their brain stops developing, actually gives the ability to develop a bigger brain, because all the extra calories go to brain development. And so if you're getting extra calories because you're cooking your food, you're getting all of these extra calories to the brain development of your infants and your children and your in utero infants, right? And so, yeah, that's real. And so when we're looking at this, we see that fire not only gives greater ability to hunt, but it actually gives the brain size that we have today. It doesn't give us our brain shape, and our brain shape is the important part, but it does give us our size, which combined with the shape does have a lot to do with it, right? So we do see that bigger brained individuals are coming from Homo erectus's uses of fire. And so their descendants have a tendency to be larger brain than they do. And as each of their descendant species or the different subspecies within them are utilizing this, each of these species are passing this on to their children, which is why Neanderthal has such huge brains, which is why we have such huge brains, right? And so when we see this, we can see that Homo erectus's use of fire really is a huge part of why we are why today, right? What is going on with us, who we are, why we are, how we're even here, comes from the fact that Homo erectus, as our very first scientist, really develops this usage of fire. When you go past the usage of fire with Homo erectus, you start to see a couple of other things. The first one that we will talk about is how they're making it across the globe. Homo erectus is really the first that has that fully expediently bipedal lower body that we do, right? And this is our ability to walk great distances without tiring too much, and just to make it over rough terrain in the way that we do. And so Homo erectus takes this and it gives them the ability to really go global. We see that roughly, 100 to, some people are pushing the Homo erectus back to, I think, 2.2 million years ago. So anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 years into their time as a species, we see that Homo erectus is leaving Africa and starting to move across the globe. And when Homo erectus starts leaving Africa and starts moving across the globe, what we're seeing at this time is that they're taking their knowledge and who they are into all of these spaces. We know that they're kind of subspecies, is what we call them sometimes, within Homo erectus. There's several different Homo species that we know of, that some we call like descendants of Homo erectus or subspecies of Homo erectus. The people that I learned from, the paleoanthropologists that I learned from, calls them subspecies, and so that's how I refer to them. This is my teaching platform. I've always taught to some level. I don't have certificates and degrees, mainly because to me, I have a lot of problems with academia. And honestly, to teach, not only does it put a paywall, not only does it make it to where you have to pay for it, it also makes it to where I'm limited in what I teach on an academic platform too. Like if I was to teach via academia, they would tell me what I can and can't say, right? They would, and it's not, you can only say things that are peer reviewed. It's, we don't want you to tell people that shit because it might give them ideas, right? And so I don't teach on a teaching scale. I use this for teaching basically. So when we're looking at this ability to move across the entire globe, right? We see, that's kind of cool. We see, but they would still severely limit what I'm teaching them, right? Like, so I know, like, because I mean, I've put several children through school, and I know that the teachers, like, they choose what you're allowed to teach. They choose what you can tell, what you can say to them, how you can say it to them, how long you have to teach it in, things like that. It's really problematic on so many levels. Even in things like out school and stuff like that, they're very politically correct in what you can teach. Like trying to teach people anti-race theory is not acceptable, even in some spaces. Like there's just a lot of things that are problematic in some of it, right? So I just use TikTok and YouTube and leave it at that. But when we see Homo erectus moving across the globe, What we are seeing is a bunch of different of their children, basically, the subspecies within them, the species that come from them moving across the globe. And we see them moving across the globe as well. I mean, we see them in Java, we see them really all across the globe, except for we have not found them in either Australia or in Turtle Island or Aviala. That does not mean that we haven't found evidence that they made it to these spaces. It just means that we haven't found skeletons of them in these spaces. So, I don't think we've actually found skeletons of them in the South Pacific. We've just seen their descendant skeletons in the South Pacific. Um, when we're looking at how they're making across the globe, it is that expedient bipedalism. A lot of people look at these early species of human and they think cavemen, and they think that these are all primitive beings who are living in caves. Well, first of all, primitive is a misnomer, right? So our idea of what primitive is pretty weird and dysfunctional anyways. And like cave living is healthy. Like if you live in a cave, your heating and cooling bills are way fucking down because it's hot in the winter and cold in the summer. There's a huge level of protection living in a cave. Because you have only this one entrance that you have to block off, and it's pretty easy to block off. And most big animals, most big predators aren't going to approach fire. So if you have fire inside of your cave and your entrance is even semi-blocked off, or maybe even not even blocked off at all, you're unlikely to get huge predators in your cave. So your cave becomes an extremely safe space. And if you're living in the same cave for 100 generations, it is a way safer space than any single human being I know today has ever experienced, because it is a space that has been your family's for 100 generations. It is not something that somebody is going to take away from you tomorrow. And it is not something where you have to move next month, right? So there is a lot about caves that isn't as, or cavemen living that isn't as primitive as we like to think. Primitive, again, being such a misnomer. When we're looking at early Homo erectus, they're probably still living in shelters that are made, just like many other animals are living in shelters that they are already made today, right? Yet I think that by the time you get to the point that you're creating fire and you're able to make clothing, which we know Homo erectus is able to do, that you're starting to get an idea that I can put a bunch of sticks together and cover them with a hide. And I think that if you're getting to a point that you're traveling, I'm not leaving my safe home that my family has lived in for, 100 generations to go over the horizon without knowing that I have a safe space to sleep that night. And I think that that is something that we should absolutely attribute to them as well, right? This knowledge of safety and how to provide safety, right? It's a very basic instinct within us. It's a very basic thought within any being, right? And so I absolutely believe that by the time Homo erectus starts moving across the globe, Homo erectus has different ways of ensuring that they have a safe space to sleep that night. My thought process is that early on, you're probably going to be adapting, branches, adapting different shelters out of what's already there, right? We're going to wander around until we find a good place, wander over this horizon until we find a good place. And then that's probably where we're going to sleep tonight. And it could be as easily as, that root complex on that tree looks like a really good shelter. It could be as much as I have a few sticks that I can gather up and tie together, and then I put some boughs or some branches over them, or even as complex as I do that and put a hide over the top of it. So I don't believe that the idea that they're all living in caves the entire time is really correct. Now, many archaeologists and anthropologists would agree with me or would disagree with me. My thought process comes from my understanding of humanity, that is an indigenous understanding of humanity and an understanding of what we're capable of, and what this is, right? And so I'm not going to say that that's a thought process that a lot of different archaeologists are going to share with me. I personally believe, though, that personally to me is what makes the most sense in my knowledge. So when we're looking at them moving across the globe, we absolutely see them moving across the globe, and we absolutely see their descendants or their subspecies absolutely crossing water. And how we understand this is the fact that we see Neanderthal and Denisovan really on the main Eurasian continent, right? Yet when we get over to the islands of the South Pacific, we see the hobbit species, Florensis, and the island of Flores in Indonesia. When you look at the island of Flores in Indonesia, the island of Flores is directly in the middle of what is called the Wallace Trench or the Wallace Line. And this is a deep, deep space in the sea between two continental shelves that has never been above sea level. So everything in that space, all the islands in that space, have never had land attached to them. The water has never gone down so much that there's land attached to them or continents attached to them. So to get to the island of Flores, they had to cross water. We also found in the last couple of years Luzonensis on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, right? And when we're looking at that, this is below the Wallace line. So this is also a crossing of water. This is also going across a body of water to get to these islands in the Philippines. Most people are unaware that the islands of the South Pacific, it's in a volcano space. It's a ring of fire, we hear of it referred to. And this means that the islands there, they come and go. Like they are, I was asking my professor when I was studying Oceania, which is the islands in the South Pacific. And I was like, how do you know that certain indigenous groups have only been there for 25,000 or 2,500 years? I mean, that seems a bit presumptuous. And he was like, the reason that we know that this group has only been on this island for 2,500 years is because this island has only existed for 2,500 years. Now, that doesn't mean, and he didn't go on to say this, I'm going on to say this doesn't mean that those indigenous groups weren't on other islands and those islands sunk. It means that those islands that they're on currently have only been there for 2,500 years. So when we look at these different groups in islands in the South Pacific that we found currently, that doesn't mean that there are not others that have already sunk underneath the sea because their islands have sunk underneath the sea. Doesn't mean that there's other evidence out there that we've lost, right? We do see with Erectus that it speciates across the globe into several different species. We have 6 that we see in the fossil record, and the 6 that we see in the fossil record from the order of their development or our discovery of them are Neanderthal, which we discover in the 1850s and totally resets our understanding of us. Before this, we think that the world is 6,000 years old and God created us. Now we see that there was something before us. What happened? Yes, I did. I got live back. I argued with them enough, and I have to. Hello?
Hey, Sarah, it's Liz at North Beaverton Pet Hospital. How are you doing?
Pretty good yourself?
I'm doing great. Mr. Brand did amazing. He did fantastic, and he's recovering well.
Okay. When do you want me to come pick him up?
Would 11:30 be fantastic?
Yes, that should work. Can I push it back to 12?
We are going to lunch at noon, so Dr. Caldwell wanted us to pick up before noon or after 1.
I will do 11:30.
Perfect. Okay, we'll see you then.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Sorry about that. I know that paused my live. My dog is in the vet today, and I have to take that call because it was the vet saying that I could come and pick him up, which is not right now. I need to wait an hour, so I have another hour. When we're looking at the other species, Mia, are you guys talking about somebody else? I'm confused by that conversation. When we're looking at the other species that we see from Homo erectus, what we see is starting with Neanderthal in the 1850s. And again, this totally changes our thought process of what is going on with our species. But then we don't see anything else for like 150 years. The next thing, okay, perfect. Thank you. The next thing that we see in the fossil record is when we find Homo florensis. Now, we find Homo florensis in 2003. This is right after Lord of the Rings, the movie, comes out. And Homo florensis is like 3'5" at its height and has big feet. So as you imagine, we have nicknamed this species the Hobbit species. Homo florensis, there was only about 50 of them found so far. And the lead anthropologist on it, the doctorate of anthropology who is working on it, actually there are tales of sightings of Homo erectus within the last 50 years. So he is currently investigating whether or not erectus, I'm sorry, florensis. So he's currently investigating whether or not Homo florensis still actually exists out there. So there might be another Homo species still out there. And this is on the island of Flores in Indonesia. This we find in 2003. In about 2012, we find Homo naledi. Now, Homo naledi is the one from the documentary that we were talking about when we first came in, the Cave of Bones documentary on Netflix under Unknown Cave of Bones. And the Homo naledi find is found in the Rising Star Caves in South Africa near Johannesburg. And it is this kind of short species. And it also shows us this evolution isn't linear thing that most anthropologists and archaeologists already knew, but that most people really don't know, because Homo naledi is actually kind of like its lower body is staying the same as that time frame and the other beings around it in that time frame. Its upper body goes back a couple million years to Australopithecus, and then its brain leaps forward 200,000 years to a brain shape and ideas that we don't see within us for another couple 100,000 years. And so you see that Homo naledi is just this fascinating being in so many different parts of it. They actually are the first that we have that have burials, and they actually have cave art. And this is all some very new understandings coming out of the Rising Star Cave in South Africa. After Homo naledi, pretty much right after that, we find Denisovan. Where do we find Denisovan first? I think I might be getting those backwards, the last two things. Maybe Denisovan is in 2010. But we find Denisovan from a finger bone, a phalange, the tip of a finger in Denisova Cave. Denisova Cave in Russia has thousands and thousands of fragments of bones in them, and we thought that they were Neanderthal this whole time. The advent of polymerase chain reaction and DNA testing, which is what Svante Pablo won the Nobel Peace Prize for last year, actually takes a singular strand of DNA and replicates it millions of times and gave us the ability to test ancient DNA. And so with that, we started testing the bones that were in the Denisova Cave, and then we find Homo denisovan. And Homo denisovan, we don't have a whole lot of them yet. I think we have about like everything we have of Homo denisovan fits in the palm of your hand except for one mandible. And so we don't have a whole lot on their species yet, but we also have a lot on their species yet. The dates for Homo naledi are 335,000 years ago to 235,000 years ago. To put this in comparison, the oldest of us that they have found is 300,000 years ago in Morocco. And they do not believe that we solidified as a singular species of us until 125 to 130,000 years ago. So that's all very new information, like last 3 months, new information, not the oldest. That's the last year and a half because they redated a find that they had already had. So when we're looking at Denisovan, we know like their genetics. We have a full genome of them. We know that Neanderthal's Y DNA in its early part was Denisovan and its last part was sapien. Neanderthal doesn't seem to have a Y DNA. We know that with Denisovan, we know where their descendants are today, like people with Denisovan genes within them. We know some of the different things that they gave us. But we don't have like a full skull. We don't have a top of the head at all, which leads into one of the next things. So we discover Homo luzonensis in the island of the Philippines next, and Homo luzonensis is like a dwarf species. They think the tallest of them is like 4'5" or 4'8". They're a dwarf species. They're small. This comes from something called island dwarfism or island giganticism. Both them and Florensis went into island dwarfism and became smaller species. Again, the island of Luzon in the Philippines is below the Wallace Trench, so they absolutely had to cross water to get there. And then when you look at the next one, what we see is that they have a skull in China from the Long Cave in China. And the skull that they have, they redated recently and they re-examined. And when they re-examined it, they decided this is a new species. Now, there is some debate as to whether this is an entirely new species or this is Denisovan, because we don't have a full skull of Denisovan. We have a little chunk of the base of their skull, so we know Denisovan had language, but we don't have like a full skull of Denisovan, so we don't know for certain whether or not this is a Denisovan skull which we've named homolongi for now. So homolongi, long means dragon. Homolongi, or the dragon man, all we have is the cap of his skull down to, I think it's here. Like, I think it's brow ridges and up is what we've got. We do have a mandible of Denisovan, but we don't have a mandible of Longi. So our where we're at is, if we can find another thing that looks like Longi that we can DNA test and find it to be Denisovan, then we will know that Longi is Denisovan. If we find something else that looks like Longi and we DNA test it and can get DNA and it comes out to be an entirely different species, then we'll know that we have a new species. If we find a skull of Denisovan and it looks different than the skull of Longi, then we know that we have a new species. Until then, we are calling it a new species. We're calling it Homolongi. So this gives us a total of 6 species that we have found that all descended from Homo erectus in the fossil record, that lived alongside us. There are other species that descend from Homo erectus in the fossil record. We have Heidelbergensis, we have Antecessor, we have Ergaster. All of these are either subspecies of Homo erectus or child species of Homo erectus. Hi, Sleepy. And since they're all either subspecies of Homo erectus or child species of Homo erectus, they all come from Homo erectus as well. But I'm tending to go with the ones that we know lived alongside us and lived in the same time frames that we lived in. So those are the 6 that we see in our time frame: Neanderthal, Florensis, Denisovan, Naledi, Longi, and Luzonensis. Yes, so all of these species are going to be from Homo erectus. So all of these species are species that, as Homo erectus is making it across the globe, so Homo erectus's child species or subspecies of Heidelbergensis goes into West Eurasia. And this is where we get Neanderthal speciating out of them. We're pretty sure that Heidelbergensis and Neanderthal are kind of where Denisovan come from, that Denisovan and Neanderthal are pretty closely related. But they would have come from Heidelbergensis, which comes from Erectus. So they are a grandchild of Homo erectus, basically. We're basically a grandchild of Homo erectus as well. So I tend to think of these all as grandchildren. So all of our cousins, right? So Neanderthal would be a grandchild of Homo erectus, probably coming out of Heidelbergensis. Maybe Heidelbergensis and Antecessor is what they're saying, right? As we're looking at all of the different things. The only ones that we have DNA from are Neanderthal and Denisovan. We don't have DNA from any of the others, so it's not like we can compare genetics. We're just comparing morphology. We're just comparing our understandings, right? When we look at Denisovan, this is another grandchild of Homo erectus. Again, we are thinking, I believe, that it probably comes from Heidelbergensis, maybe like as Heidelbergensis is coming into Neanderthal, basically. And then we see Florensis, which is actually, we're thinking maybe a child of Ergaster, so a grandchild of Erectus as well. Luzonensis, they haven't decided, like, you know, is it one of the subspecies? Is it directly Homo erectus? Is this a child or a grandchild? And Longi, we just don't know anything of now, but it would be assumed that they are a grandchild of Homo erectus because Homo erectus and its subspecies are the ones that are making it out and are going, they're the only ones that we have found outside, right? So it is understood that all of these are descendant species of Homo erectus. And they're extinct now because they've lived their time on the planet. Homo erectus was around for 2 million years. Homo neanderthal was around for 600,000 years. We've only been here 300,000 years ourselves. So like every other life cycle, their life cycle as a species had ended. And that's why many of them are gone. Many of them aren't gone, though. Like Neanderthal isn't really gone. Neanderthal gets enveloped within us. Denisovan gets enveloped within us. By the time we meet up with Neanderthal, Neanderthal is such a small species already that our meeting up with them helps them. It's what keeps them here because they are inbred at this time. And so half of their children are being born inbred, which causes deformity, which causes issues, right? And because of this, bringing in those extra genes that we bring in with us actually makes it a lot easier for Neanderthal to survive. Because Denisovan is not in Northwest Europe at all. So the only places that we believe that Denisovans really were, so we do, of course, see the Denisova cave in Russia, but we don't see any Denisovan genes in anybody surrounding that cave, like any of the peoples that are currently there today surrounding the cave. We do see that Denisovan genes are primarily in the southeastern tip of Asia, and that they're also in the islands of the South Pacific and in the indigenous Australians and within Turtle Island indigenous people, which is probably where you're getting it, Jones. So we see that Denisovan is in Southeast Eurasia, and we see that Denisovan is in the islands of the South Pacific, Australia, indigenous people. Indigenous Australians and indigenous Papua New Guineans are the two that have the highest percentage of Denisovan DNA. And then indigenous Turtle Islanders and Abayalians actually have the lower percentage. They have 0.02 to 0.03% Denisovan DNA within them. And this is because after 50,000 years ago, when people were moving across the lower tip of Eurasia, the lower southeastern tip of Eurasia, because it's the only thing that's exposed up from underneath the ice then, as they're migrating into Australia and they're migrating into the Pacific Islands and they're migrating beyond that into Turtle Island through that southern boat route that is currently having a lot of papers written on it. When we're seeing that, they're picking up those Denisovan DNA as they're going along. I do too. We're siblings. So they did emerge in that region. So that's what we were just talking about. So all of these species, just to double down on that, all of these species are, do you know there's some indigenous Turtle Island indigenous mitochondrial DNA in some Icelanders and in some people in Scandinavia, and it comes from the voyages to Vinland and the voyages that they took, the Icelanders took over. They apparently brought back a couple of people, and there is actually like 80 people with mitochondrial DNA from Turtle Islanders in Iceland. So that could be right. But it could be that, and it could also be that backward migration, though to my knowledge we don't see it in Siberia and stuff. But it could be some of that backwards migration that we see that could get it to you too. But when we're looking at these different species, what we're looking at is Erectus starts in Africa, but as it went outside of Africa, we're seeing that it speciates in different places. So Neanderthal never makes it into Africa, and Denisovan never makes it into Africa, and Florensis never makes it into Africa. These all speciate outside of Africa, right? Yeah, the back and forth. Well, and I believe, honestly, if you look at the top of the map, like if you look at the top of the globe from a Arctic view, you can actually see where boat island hopping Arctic people probably knew way more of each other than we like to think they knew of each other, right? Just because there's that, it's nothing. Like if we're out on boats in the ice and going between different ice points or different ice islands all the time, and we're getting our food from the water anyways, that back and forth is way more likely than a lot of people believe, right? So absolutely, I think that can come. Well, and I think it can come from a number of different spaces. I mean, I don't think we've ever gone over I don't think we've ever had a conversation of different spaces of ancestry. So it could actually come from quite a few different spaces, I would think. But when we're looking at these different species, to the question that was asked before, they're absolutely speciating outside of Africa. We still, as Homo sapien, absolutely speciates inside of Africa. We do pick up genetics from these different groups outside of Africa, and we absolutely do see Neanderthal DNA in pretty much all of Africa, except for two populations throughout the or before colonization. Finds from before colonization, and that's because Neanderthal and sapien lived for like 100,000 years together in the Levant, in the Arabian Peninsula, all up in that north eastern part of Africa, and that south western part of Asia for like 100,000 years. And they do a lot of their intermixing there, and then people migrate back into Africa, and so they take that Neanderthal DNA back into Africa. So we do see Neanderthal DNA, but we in Africa, but we never see that Neanderthals, or we have no thought process that Neanderthal actually goes into Africa. Yeah. Egel as well. Egel was dark as skin. There's several people in the sagas who are deemed as having been dark of skin. It's actually like there's a lot of stuff people don't want to pay attention to. Um, but so those are all species we absolutely see outside of Africa and speciating outside of Africa. And so we can kind of track people's migration outside of Africa, Homo sapiens migration outside of Africa, by where they enveloped these other species into them, where they brought these other species into their being. And our understanding is absolutely that it is not that they killed off anybody, that we did not kill off anybody as we're moving out. Instead of killing people off, we do what we've always done, and we just become big bands. Again, if you're coming in later, tribe is a word that is used to denote a community based on genetic lineage. Band is a word used to denote a community not based on genetic lineage. So a group or a community that has several different species within it is going to be a band. A group or a community that is entirely based on, great great grandmother, that's going to be a tribe. So when we're looking at Homo sapien in our earliest beings, we come to being from being in a group that has many different bands, and it's these many different bands of many different species that actually creates us as our newest knowledge on it. And so we absolutely see that we don't have this idea of othering. And so when we're moving across the planet, when we see these other species, instead of othering them or hating them or fearing them, instead we envelop them within us, because that's what we naturally do. And so we do see that besides Denisovan and Neanderthal, we actually see 5 ghost species within us. And ghost species are species where you see just a fragment of their DNA or their genome in our genome, but we haven't found them we haven't found their full genome. We haven't found them in the fossil record, or if we haven't gotten DNA out of them. I have heard people think that with the uncanny valley, that it is fearing other species. I don't know on it. I do not take it like that, only because I don't see evidence that we were actually pillaging and causing damage and hating other species early on, especially with this newest understanding that we actually come out of a convergence of species instead of a singular species, and adaptation from a singular species, right? So whereas Neanderthal is thought to have come from the adaptation of Homo heidelbergensis into the space in Europe that they're at, right? Changing for that space, because again, heidelbergensis would have started out dark. They would have started out with dark eyes. They would have started out with tightly coiled hair so that they could survive in Africa, where they start out at, right? So as they're getting into Northwest Europe and they're starting to live in a low light environment, they're starting to A, get the gene for light skin alleles, and B, actually lighten up. Their eyes are getting lighter, different things are changing so that they can adapt to that cold and low light environment. And it is all those adaptations over such a long period of time that really become the foundation of Neanderthal. Cheddarman is actually sapien. Cheddarman's only like 10,000 years old. He's actually Homo sapien. But the adaptations that Heidelbergensis is going through creates Neanderthal. When we look at us, we now know, and this is like within the last 6 months, we now know that our coming doesn't come from isolation adaptation. Our coming comes from a convergence. This is something that was actually thought to be a theoretical way to make a species. We had no proof in the rest of the world about how you can make a species by a convergence of many species until we get to us. And again, this is like 6 months old. So our new understanding is that it is the fact that Homo erectus is living in several different bands of, Heidelbergensis or Gaster, Antecessor, all in several different bands. And that it is the mixing within those bands that starts creating the earliest Homo sapiens. And that, think of bands within nations, and nations, might get together once a year or once every 5 years for like a big, I'm just speaking Norwegian, so on top of my head is a ting, right? So you're getting together every couple of years for a big alting, right? So in that gathering or that festival every couple of years, you're coming together. And if you've got this band over here and this band over here and this band over here, and each of them have a child that looks like Homo sapien, and they're coming together, and all the different Homo sapien children are like, ooh, you're half, I bet you're half Heidelbergensis and ancestor like I am, right? And so then you're coming together in this convergence, and you have these communities developing of several different Homo sapiens in these communities and these bands. And then you get a few different communities that are Homo sapien within these bands of Heidelbergensis and ancestor and stuff like that. And then those communities start to come together as one community, and that convergence in the end becomes sapien. Again, we see that the earliest is like 300,000 years ago, and our current understanding is that the ending of that convergence is like 135 to 125,000 years ago. So he probably has Neanderthal in him, I would think. But I haven't heard anything about Cheddarman having Neanderthal DNA in him. It is a possibility, I would think. The dark skin, though, comes from the fact that he's sapien. We all start dark. Sapiens all start dark. It's not until sapien actually gets up into, even after we get some of that admixture from Neanderthal, it's not like we all go ultra light right away. Like we might go a little bit lighter, some of us, but it's a range. It's always going to be a range anyways. And then you see that as sapien is moving up through, our current understanding is that sapien moving through Eurasia is going through Eurasia darkest skin. They get lighter eyes first, and then they start getting lighter skin. But they don't start getting lighter skin until like this. Not as a in a group of 50, you might always have somebody who's lighter skin and always have somebody who's darker skin, right? At about 5 to 6,000 years ago, we see that in a group of 50, maybe 50% of them are lighter skin and 50% of them are darker skin. And then as you move forward more, even like 1,000 years ago, like we were just saying, we see that there's still a part of the population, a good portion, roughly 10% of the population in Scandinavia and in northern, like in Ireland and Scotland and those areas and those regions who are still darker of skin. And again, it's a range. It's not like really, really dark or really, really light, though the alleles for Cheddarman's skin color, they state that they find no light skin alleles in Cheddarman's alleles at all, and the alleles that they do find are her dark, like they're very dark. So, but we absolutely see. We do have DNA of Nordic Vikings. BJ581, the Viking warrior woman is partially Scandinavian. She's Danish, and her descendants would be Danish and Iberian, Latvian, and a couple of other things, but not Swedish because she's found in Sweden, but Norwegian, I think, is the other one. But it's a couple other species. We absolutely do. And there's like they did a study on, and that's probably what Fable's talking about, where they did a study on like 2,000 years worth of graves, and maybe a little bit further back. And what they discovered was that Scandinavia was settled by two different groups, one being the dark-skinned, light-eyed people coming from the south, and one being the light-skinned, dark-eyed people coming from the east, so from the eastern steppes. And they brought in the Finno-Uriaic language, and the the darker-skinned, lighter-eyed people coming up, probably associating with their Germanic groups at the time, their Germanic language groups at the time. But we do see that we actually have a lot of Viking Age DNA. We have 3 Viking Age Viking burial DNAs in England that are African DNA, like 2 males and 1 little girl who was buried next to her aunts, and she is like 33% Northwest African, and then the rest of her is Northwest European farmer. So like there is a lot of intermix and interflex too. Yeah, and that would be what we're talking about, that Finno-Uriaic from the steppes, coming over from the steppes, that lighter skin, darker eyed group coming over from the steppes well, that darker skin, lighter eyed group is coming up from the south. So yeah, so I do believe in the giants. Being indigenous, being raised in indigenous communities, and my first history is actually being from indigenous elders. I've always known of the giants. I do believe in the giants. I do believe the Ceruti Macedon vine is probably the giants, to be honest. But like, that's not something you say in academic circles and anybody takes you seriously. So I haven't gotten there yet. But I do believe that that's probably what we're looking at there. Just because if you look at island giganticism and island dwarfism, and you look at the evidence that was there, though most of it has been destroyed, I think if you put it all together, it makes total sense. And especially if you actually listen to indigenous people, right? So some of the markers can be the same, but not all of them. So most of the DNA, the mitochondrial DNA that you find here in Turtle Island or Abayala is unique to Turtle Island and Abayala. Now you can trace it backwards where, there might be, well, we can trace everything back to the original population within Africa. And we actually know what the original population within Africa was, right? So we can absolutely trace everybody back there. So if I have a group of 30 people, and we're not really related, maybe we're distant cousins, maybe, maybe all the women in our group were so early on that they're all pretty much the same mitochondrial DNA. And as we're moving out and new DNAs are being developed, new mitochondrial. So mitochondrial DNA and Y DNA, what happens is so if I have 5 daughters, each of my daughters is going to get 2 X's, and she's going to get an X from me and an X from her father. Now, the X that she gets from her father is going to be pretty much the same X for each one of my daughters. And the reason each one of my daughters is going to get the same X from her father is because he's only got 1 X. From me, she's going to get a combination of the 2 X's I have. And so she's going to get an entirely new X from me. And each one of my 5 daughters is going to get a different X from me. And so the X that she passes down is going to be a combination of my X and her father's X. So it's going to be an entirely new. And they don't combine evenly, right? So like I might, pass 33% of my mother's X and 69% of my, we'll go with 30 and 70. 30% of my mother's X and 70% of my father's X onto daughter A, and 70% of my mother's X and 30% of my father's X onto daughter B, and 50% of each onto daughter C, and 25 and 75 onto daughter D. So I'm going to give each daughter a different combination of that X. So each daughter is able to pass on a specific X, right? And she's going to combine it differently into each of her daughters as well, right? So if 5 of my daughters are born and only one of my daughter actually is fertile enough for her genetic offspring to actually continue along a line, then she is going to be a foundation of a mitochondrial. She is going to be what we call a mitochondrial Eve. Same thing with the son. He's going to be a foundation, a mitochondrial, or not a Y atom, right? So with a mitochondrial Eve, it doesn't mean that she was the only one there. It means that she's the only one to have passed on her genetics. And if I have daughter A and daughter B, daughter A's mitochondrial DNA that she passes on is going to be different than B's mitochondrial DNA that she passes on. So B can be a foundation Eve here, and A can be a foundation Eve over here. So when we're looking at people moving through a space, what it is if I have a group of 30 people and we are maybe all cousins, or maybe, like not all, maybe we're a band and we have a couple of different lineages within, but those lineages kind of converge within our band. And 15 move on into a new space and 15 stay. The 15 that move on are not descended from the 15 that stayed, right? So this idea that like Turtle Island indigenous people or Abayalians are descended from Asian people isn't true. What it is that we're moving through, and sometimes we're moving through as a group in the same space, but we're moving on. It's not that we left our grandparents behind. It's not that we left our siblings behind. It's that, maybe we left half of the community behind and half of the community moved on. The other thing is that isn't often thought about or considered is that entire group of 30 often moves on completely and doesn't leave anybody behind. And the group of 30 that comes and then settles in that space and stays in that space might share some genetic markers, because we all share genetic markers in our foundation thought process, but it doesn't mean that it's a descendant group or an ancestor group, right? It just means that we share some genetic markers because we all share genetic markers. There are some things that we can see, like the X1 mitochondrial DNA in Turtle Island and Yaba Yala, where the X2 mitochondrial DNA is in Siberia. This means that this is a backward migration. The X1 is here, the first is here, and then the backward migration is there. We do see that C1 is a mitochondrial DNA here and in Abya, in Turtle Island and Abya, and C is actually back in, God, where is C again? I don't think it's like in East Asia at all. I think it's in West Asia, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But C is one that we see here, and C1 and all the descendancy of C1 is here, whereas C is there. Now C is there and C2 is here and C3 is here, right? And C1 is over here. It doesn't mean that we're a descendant from C2 or C3. It doesn't even mean that we're a descendant of C1. It means that part of this group is moving on. Cheddarmen is one of a group of what they call northwest farmers or hunter-gatherers. Maybe it's hunter-gatherers at that point. Northwest European hunter-gatherers. So that mitochondrial DNA or that Y DNA that we see in him is shared in that group, right? And we see that same mitochondrial DNA and that same Y DNA in, I think it's like 15% of, or 13%. It's 13% of Northwest Europeans. That does not mean that 50 or 13% of Northwest Europeans is descended from Cheddarmen. It means that they're descended from the group that Cheddarmen was a part of. Cheddarmen only has one direct descendant, and that is a man who lives less than a mile from where his 300 generation old grandfather lives. Like less than a mile from where Cheddarmen was found. So, but he's only got one descendant, but the DNA markers from that entire group are seen across all of Northwest Europe. It doesn't mean that they are the same. It doesn't mean that they're descended from, right? And the only reason that I really like to double down on that is because there's a lot of people that like to claim that Turtle Islanders or Abyalians aren't indigenous to here because we came from somewhere else. Everybody came from somewhere else. First of all, we all came from somewhere else, unless you are currently in Africa and have been there the entire time. We all came from somewhere else. There's this usage of that idea to state that, well, it doesn't matter that it was taken from you because it wasn't yours to begin with, right? And so we have to steer clear of this idea that Turtle Islanders or Abyalians are descended from Asians, because they're not. They may have belonged at some point in the distant past to the same populations, but those populations split, and it's not that we left grandpa behind and moved on our own, and therefore like our aunts and uncles stayed there, and so we're descending from them. Just because the clarity is always a good thing to have. When we look at back to Homo erectus, the way that Homo erectus makes it across the globe, we do see that he speciates everywhere. And when we see Homo erectus speciating everywhere, we do see that there are 6 ghost species that we see. We see one of those ghost species within Neanderthal and Denisovan. We don't see it here within us. But 5 ghost species are seen within us. And again, ghost species are a species that we see just a little fragment of their genome in our genome, just a little hair of it, kind of the same amount that we see of Neanderthal and Denisovan, though much lesser. I think that the most that we've seen is like 1%. And so with that, what we're seeing is some of those other species that speciated from Homo erectus, right? And where we see those species is pretty important. In Africa, like I was saying earlier, pretty much everybody has Neanderthal DNA from that backwards migration. There are two species in Africa that do not have Neanderthal DNA. They're the only two species on the entire planet that don't have Neanderthal DNA. This is the Oyo population and the Kwe population, two separate communities. They're broader nations. They have many different tribes within or bands within their broader nations, but these are the two peoples that we see that do not have Neanderthal DNA. But what we do see within their DNA is three of those ghost species within their DNA. The Kwe population is the foundation population of all sapien. We see all of the genetics in the Kwe population. There is not a genetic in Homo sapien that you cannot find within the Kwe population, and we do believe that this is our founding population. This is the oldest population, the original population, to our current knowledge. When we're moving outside of Africa, we do see two other ghost species, and where we see those two other ghost species is extremely important. We see one of those ghost species in indigenous Australians. We also see within Australia the 120,000-year-old Moy Hill site, which is fire-cracked rock, evidence of fire pits, and food items. And with this 120,000 years old, we're not really converged as a species. We're not really outside the Levant area. This is Homo erectus having made it to that island or to Australia and having speciated in Australia. And so when sapien makes it to Australia, as indigenous Australians do at 70,000 years ago, they're the first outside of Africa to stay outside of Africa and create a new space. When sapiens make it to Australia at 70,000 years ago, they envelop this species, who is probably, like all other species from Erectus that develop outside of Africa, a very small species at this time, very genetically narrow at this time. And so having those outside genes from sapien probably really helped that species, and they are able to live on in us. And then when we look across the water, when you see that southern boat route that gives the Denisovan DNA that you see in Abyalians and Turtle Islanders, we see currently DNA is telling us that it could possibly be that Turtle Islanders and Abyalians have been here for 52,000 years. That is like 2 weeks old, so new I don't even know yet. Like, that's so new. I'm not sure yet what's going on with it, so I'm not exactly sure on it. The before that understanding was developing that we have been here for at least 35,000 years. When we look at Turtle Island and Abyala, we see that there is that ghost species, or is a ghost species that we see in indigenous Turtle Islanders and indigenous Abyalians. We also see that there is the 130,000-year-old Cerruti mastodon find in San Diego at the Natural History Museum down there. It's the lead archaeologist for their National History Museum who's studying it. This is juvenile mastodon bones that have been cracked and broken and twisted apart and in and among hammerstones and cobblestones, leading back to that original conversation we had about the Oldowan tool complex having hammerstones and cobblestones within it. And when you're looking, have a great one. Good luck. Much love to you, Brittany. So when we're seeing that that site, what we're seeing is most likely a descendant species of Homo erectus is the accepted understanding of it. This would unlikely to be Homo sapien, as again, Homo sapien really isn't out of the Levant and really hasn't converged as a singular species. And we're using more advanced tools than from our very inception, because Heidelbergensis and Neanderthal are already using more advanced tools, right? So we're using more advanced tools than the Oldowan tool complex as well. And so it's very unlikely that this is us. It is most likely that this is another species that is speciated from Homo erectus. No, dinosaurs are already gone for like 200 million years by the time any hominins come into play. And so in seeing the Cerruti mastodon find and seeing this species that we find here in Turtle Island indigenous people and in Abyalians, we are absolutely seeing a correlation between the two. So this most likely is a species that speciated here from Homo erectus. And because they speciated here from Homo erectus, they're most likely to be a smaller genetic species. And so by the time Homo sapien gets here, they are enveloped into Homo sapien easily and lovingly, like we did with everybody else. With all of this, we're absolutely seeing that there isn't a lot of war. There isn't a lot of fighting. There isn't a lot of evidence of humans damaging other humans at this time. Most of this most of this ability to go around the world comes from that scientific thought process that we were talking about with Erectus from the beginning. We now know that Erectus has language. We now know, hi Leanne, we now know that Erectus has clothing. We now, and the reason that we know with clothing is because body lice. So body lice is something that develops from head lice, speciates from head lice, takes several 100,000 years to speciate from head lice, but it can't speciate from head lice until you see this bare skin, until the hair covering our bodies is gone, because otherwise it's just all hair lice, right? But it's not going to just wander around your body, because I don't know if you've ever seen lice, but you can see them motherfuckers when they're wandering around your body, right? So it's not just going to wander around your body because of protein, right? That's edible. Instead of wandering around your body, it's going to stay in your hair. To put clothing on your body gives lice a place to hide. And so our understanding is that body lice develops after several hundred years after we're already putting clothing on our body. And so we do believe that Homo erectus had clothing. We see that Homo erectus has fire. We see that with the way we find fossils and artifacts or belongings of Homo erectus, that it's absolutely understood that they do make it across the globe, that they are seen in really every continent. They are seen on every space. And we also see that this is that ability to cross water. And I'm trying to make sure that I have everything underneath my lid. Fire, language, clothing, shelter, travel. Yes. Okay, just wanted to make sure. So when we do see them all moving across the globe, we absolutely see that this movement across this globe and this movement into different spaces is one of the most brilliant things about Homo erectus. It is, again, the first to make it outside of Africa of the hominin species. It is, again, the first to find fire. It is the first to change tools from the Paranthropus boisei Oldowan tool complex into a new tool complex, adapting the adaptation. It makes it across the globe as its subspecies, as its children and its grandchildren, and it speciates in many different spaces. And this is where we get that multi-regional speciation theory from. Even within the multi-regional speciation, though, we always need to double down on the understanding that we are still one species. Even if we have other species and admixture in us, we are still one species. The reason that we know that we are all one species is because we can fuck like rabbits and get away with it and have babies. Different species who are interbreeding, who create hybrid children of two different species, most hybrid children are infertile if they make it past birth, right? Most hybrid children are inviable, and so they aren't born. Most hybrid children today are unable to, or most hybrid children, not today, most hybrid children are unable to make it out of infancy if they are born, make it past toddlerhood. Denny, the hybrid that we have with Neanderthal and Denisovan, only lasted until she was 13 years old. Hybrids have a lesser ability to survive. They have a lower survivability. And if they do make it to adulthood, most of them are infertile, like a mule is infertile as a hybrid between a donkey and a horse. Every once in a while, you'll get a fertile mule. This is how every once in a while we get a fertile hybrid between Neanderthal and Denisovan, or Neanderthal and Sapien, or Denisovan and Sapien, and they're able to reproduce and add those genes into our species as a whole. And yet we are all still one species. We do not all have the same admixture. We are all Homo sapien. The vast majority of us, except for the Oyo and the Kwe people, have Neanderthal in us. The Oyo and the Kwe people have 3 ghost species. Southeast Asia, Australia, the islands of the South Pacific, Turtle Island, and Abayala have Denisovan. Indigenous Australians have a ghost species, and Turtle Islanders and Abayalians, indigenous people, have a ghost species. And then there's the one ghost species that we see within Neanderthal and Denisovan, but that doesn't really count within us. So we are all Homo sapien with admixture from other species. We all have admixture from other species. We are all the same, and yet we are all different on so many levels as well, right? Which is one of the brilliant things about our species, because monolithic anything doesn't help, right? If we're all the same, then who is inventing the new things? If we all enjoy doing the same things, then who's the musicians and who's the painters, right? Like, If we all enjoy IT, then who the fuck is doing the back work, right? Like, we should not all be enjoying the same thing. We should all be the same, right? So we are all the same species. We all have admixture from other species, and we all have admixture from other spaces too, outside. Like, even after Homo sapien comes into being as the only species still here, we still see that there's, you can be like the little girl from Viking age Britain who is in a Viking burial, who is buried besides her aunt, and she is 70 something percent Northwest European and 33% Northwest African, right? So we all have a lot of admixture within us. We are all the same species, though, and that is very important. It's also very important to understand that this admixture doesn't make us into different races or different species. We've debunked the idea that race exists. It's a colonial construct used to justify the atrocities of Europeans. And so we should not be finding new ways to make race exist when we have already debunked race. Species and different species within us does give us things in different spaces. We now believe that the Tibetans have their high altitude air ability from the Denisovans. And we are seeing a couple of different things that are handed down from different species in a couple of different spaces. Yet we also are still all the same species. Some of us have just gotten a little bit of an adaptation differently. Like, some of us have a little bit of an adaptation in Northwest Europe, and some of us have a little bit of an adaptation to South Africa, right? Some of us have little bits of different adaptations to different spaces. That is one of the amazing and brilliant things about our species, is that we can adapt. And adaptation takes 100 generations to fully adapt. So 2,500 years at our current rate of generation. And yet you can see adaptations in in a new generation. Our current understanding of the way that skin alleles work is that, genetics do have a play in it. The sunlight that hits the mother while she's pregnant actually has a play in the skin color of a child as well, right? So all of these different adaptations are what gives us the ability to move to different spaces and live and grow within different spaces, right? And that ability is a big part of what makes humanity amazing. We are always nurturing, we are always communal, and we are always creative. Hate and othering is something that was invented to keep us suppressed and oppressed. And so when you participate in the hating and the othering, it's really about giving government control and about making sure that those who are in charge stay in charge, because you're never hating on the people who are actually doing the damage. You're always hating on the people that they want you to hate on. I am going to have to go because I've got to go pick up my puppy. So I am a little bit less time, but it's roughly 2 hours than I would have liked to be. I might try and come back on later this evening, depending on what's going on in my life around me. But I will definitely be on, not tomorrow, but most likely Thursday. I don't know, Dakota. I'm not sure on that one. You're welcome, Tamara. It's good to see you come in. Thank you, everybody, so much. Love you all so much, and I will see you guys later. Remember that we are nurturing and communal and creative. And if you are feeling that depression and that loneliness and that anxiety and that disconnect, you're healthy, because anybody who doesn't feel that in this time when we are so disconnected has actually got some problems going, because where we are living and how we are living today is really antithesis to who we are as a species, and our needs are not being met. And if you're feeling that, it's because you know that, and you are a part of the change to make sure we get back there. Love you guys so much. Thank you guys so much for listening. It's just as important for you guys to be in here and listen than it is for me to speak, because without you guys in here listening, I don't even have the desire to speak. I'll be real. Like, I'm like, so thank you all for being here and listening to me and taking what I have to say. And thank you for asking questions and participating. So much love, siblings. So much love, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. YouTube, much love to you as well. Have a great afternoon.